It was a question that haunted royal watchers for decades. Why did Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, never sleep in the same bed as Queen Elizabeth? On the surface, it seemed like a minor curiosity, something trivial in the grand tapestry of royal life. Yet, behind palace doors, it was anything but trivial. For years, whispers circled through the gilded halls, through the staff corridors, even in the private journals of those closest to the couple. And now, after years of silence, Princess and the Queen's fiercely loyal daughter has finally broken that silence. What she revealed is shocking, disturbing, and completely changes the way we think about one of the most iconic royal marriages in history. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the outside, Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth seemed like the perfect couple. They were devoted public servants, embodying the ideals of duty, poise, and stability. Their marriage, lasting more than 7 decades, was often held up as a model of steadfastness and loyalty. Yet behind that perfect exterior lay a world that few ever glimpsed. Bedrooms that were supposed to be intimate sanctuaries were, in fact, spaces of distance. Habits that were long accepted as quirks or protocol were hiding something darker, something so personal that even close family members were hesitant to speak about it. Until now, Princess, and often described as the most candid and straightforward of the royal children, has decided to shed light on a story that has been obscured by decades of discretion. She has revealed, in her own words, details about her father's behavior that are not only unusual but, in her words, disgusting. And yet, the world had assumed that their nightly separation was merely a matter of comfort, or even tradition. Was it really about protocol? Or was it something far more unsettling? What and has disclosed changes everything we thought we knew about the private life of Britain's longest-serving royal couple. Imagine the scene. Buckingham Palace, Sandringham, Windsor Castle, grand residences where the walls hold centuries of history. Within those walls, a queen and her consort shared countless public appearances, dinners, and formal ceremonies. The world saw smiles, hand-holding, and affectionate glances at official events. But behind closed doors, Philip's habits were far from charming. Princess and has painted a picture of a father whose private behavior shocked even those who grew up in the royal household, and whose routines were far from what anyone could have imagined. This isn't just a story about a man who slept in a separate bed. It's about a pattern of behavior that raises questions about intimacy, respect, and what it really means to live a life in the glare of the public eye while hiding personal truths. The revelations are startling not only for their content, but for the source. Princess Anne is known for her blunt honesty and no-nonsense demeanor. She rarely minces words, and she rarely speaks publicly about the private matters of the family. So when she calls certain behaviors disgusting, it's not hyperbole, it's a serious accusation. And because she has lived within the royal household for decades, her observations carry weight that no outside commentator could match. This is a daughter talking about her father, a family member revealing what others have only speculated about. And for many royal enthusiasts, it's a story that has been a long time coming. So why did Prince Philip choose, or need, to sleep separately from his wife? There are, of course, historical precedents. Some royals have done so for reasons of health, for convenience, or for long-standing traditions. But Anne's account suggests that the reasons were neither benign nor merely traditional. Instead, they point to habits and behaviors that were deeply personal, unusual, and at times, troubling. The line between royal eccentricity and what she describes as disgusting is blurred, and it is this ambiguity that makes the story so compelling. Viewers are drawn not just to gossip, but to understanding the complex human relationships behind the public image of monarchy. The timing of this revelation is also significant. With documentaries, biographies, and royal retrospectives flooding the media, interest in the private lives of the late Queen and her consort is at an all-time high. The public has long speculated about Philip's personality, his moods, and his idiosyncrasies, but now there is clarity coming from someone with direct knowledge. Princess Anne's disclosure doesn't just confirm rumors, it contextualizes them, giving a vivid, first-hand account of what daily life was really like behind palace walls. And it does so in a way that is both riveting and unsettling. You begin to question everything you thought you knew about a marriage that, to the world, seemed perfect. And yet, the story is not merely about Philip. It is also about Elizabeth, the queen who bore the weight of the monarchy with unwavering poise. How did she react to her husband's habits? How did she maintain composure, public duty, and personal dignity in a situation that, by all accounts, would have been deeply uncomfortable? Princess and hints at the coping mechanisms her mother employed, balancing loyalty, love, and pragmatism in ways that few could understand. It's a glimpse into the human side of a figure often mythologized, showing the quiet resilience required to navigate personal challenges in the unforgiving glare of royal expectation. Consider the emotional stakes. For decades, palace staff, courtiers, and even close family members had suspicions or observed behaviors, but remained silent out of loyalty or fear. And now, that silence is broken. Princess Anne's words do more than shock. They invite the audience to question their assumptions about privacy, marital dynamics, and the complexity of human relationships. It's a story that resonates beyond royalty, touching on universal themes of intimacy, respect, and the limits of public perception. How well can anyone truly know the people closest to them, even when they are constantly in the public eye? And what happens when a daughter finally decides to reveal what she has seen for decades? This introduction is designed to pull the viewer in immediately, to create a tension that demands resolution. From the shocking question of why Philip never shared the bed with Elizabeth, to the revelation of his disgusting habits, to the insight into Elizabeth's quiet endurance, every element is carefully crafted to maximize curiosity and engagement. The audience is not just hearing about royal quirks. They are being invited to witness a long-hidden story that changes the narrative of one of the most iconic marriages in modern history. And as Princess Anne begins to speak, the questions only deepen. What exactly did she witness? How did it affect her perception of her father and her parents' marriage? Were there moments of confrontation, of discomfort, or of unspoken tension that shaped the family dynamic for generations? The answers to these questions are not only fascinating, they are essential for anyone seeking to understand the private world of the royal family. The story promises twists, revelations, and moments that no one outside the palace has ever known. So, as we step into the world behind closed doors, we must ask ourselves, what happens when decades of silence are finally broken? How does the revelation of intimate secrets reshape our understanding of people we thought we knew? Princess Anne's story is not just about sleeping arrangements or personal habits. It's a window into the complexities of human relationships, the burdens of duty, and the hidden truths that can exist even in the most public lives. And as you watch, one thing becomes clear. What comes next is something that no one saw coming, something that will shock, surprise, and leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. Everyone thought they knew Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth. To the outside world, they were the ultimate royal couple, graceful, poised, devoted to duty, and seemingly inseparable. For decades, their public appearances were a masterclass in composure. Hand-in-hand walks, coordinated smiles, perfectly timed speeches, and a unity that suggested mutual admiration and affection. Royal watchers across the globe had come to expect a kind of fairy tale perfection. And for the longest time, no one questioned it. But appearances, as Princess Anne would later reveal, were just that, appearances. Behind the polished facades of Buckingham Palace, Windsor, and Sandringham, the reality of life with Prince Philip was far more complicated. What the world saw, an image of a devoted, loving husband, masked a private life marked by distance, tension, and habits that would shock even those most familiar with royal eccentricities. From the very beginning, the marriage had been framed as a union of duty as much as love. Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1952, a young queen suddenly thrust into immense responsibility. Philip, her consort, had to balance personal identity with the demands of supporting a monarch whose life was under constant scrutiny. On the surface, the narrative was simple: a queen devoted to her country, a prince devoted to his queen. But the details that Princess Anne has now shared suggest that the personal dimension of their marriage was far from harmonious. Imagine the public perception versus the private reality. Publicly, Philip was charming, witty, and occasionally irreverent. A man who could tell a joke in the face of ceremony and entertain the press with his blunt humor. Privately, however, his routines were peculiar. Staff would recall habits that went beyond mere quirks, habits that Elizabeth herself endured silently for decades. Princess, and observing from the closest possible vantage point, witnessed firsthand a father whose private behavior contrasted sharply with the image projected to the world. What was most surprising, according to Anne, was the sheer contrast between intimacy and distance. In public, Philip was present, attentive, and often affectionate in subtle ways. In private, however, there was a separation so pronounced that it became nearly ritualistic. And this separation wasn't simply about preference or comfort. It had a basis in behavior that Anne describes as disturbing. It was, she says, disgusting. And that word alone carries a weight that few in the royal circle would dare speak aloud. Consider the psychological dimension. How does a young royal grow up witnessing such a dynamic between parents? For Princess Anne and her siblings, the difference between public image and private reality was a lesson in contradiction. On one hand, they were expected to admire and emulate the poise and grace of their mother and father. On the other, they observed behaviors behind closed doors that seemed at odds with the idealized image of their parents' love and devotion. This duality, and later explained, shaped her understanding of human complexity and left lasting impressions about privacy, honesty, and the courage required to speak truthfully about family. Staff members, too, played a critical role in observing and navigating the delicate terrain between appearances and reality. But the palace is a world where discretion is paramount. Rumors, no matter how credible, were never openly discussed. Those who witnessed Philip's private habits or Elizabeth's coping mechanisms could speak only in whispers, often cloaked in humor or euphemism. For decades, this created a culture of silence, a silence that protected the image of the monarchy but obscured the personal truths that Princess Anne has now courageously revealed. The tension between image and reality was not only about behavior, but also about ritual. Royal protocol dictated public displays of unity, attending ceremonies together, hosting dignitaries, participating in state functions as a cohesive unit. These appearances required meticulous planning, rehearsed smiles, and the suspension of any personal grievance. Behind the curtains, however, Elizabeth and Philip's private routines diverged sharply. And hints that this divergence was not merely about sleeping arrangements. It reflected a deeper discomfort, a set of habits and preferences that created private distance even within the confines of shared domestic spaces. To understand this contrast fully, one must also consider the broader historical and cultural context. Mid-20th century Britain was a world of rigid expectations, especially for those in positions of prominence. Public decorum was paramount. Personal eccentricities were tolerated but hidden, and family life, even for royals, was often a carefully managed performance. In such an environment, what might seem unusual or unacceptable in ordinary households became normalized within the palace. And yet, Anne's revelations suggest that some behaviors crossed the line, creating personal discomfort and emotional strain that lasted decades. For Princess Anne, observing these dynamics was not a passive experience. She saw how her mother maintained composure in the face of behavior that would have unsettled anyone. She saw how her father's routines, privately tolerated by the Queen, created patterns of distance that shaped the family's domestic life. She saw the subtle negotiations, the unspoken compromises, and the quiet endurance required to maintain harmony in a household under constant public scrutiny. And most importantly, she recognized that these private realities, hidden from view, were essential to understanding the true nature of her parents' relationship. It's tempting to think that distance in a marriage is always benign, sometimes even healthy. Many couples sleep separately for practical reasons, snoring, health issues, or simply preference. But what Anne describes goes far beyond simple preference. The behaviors she witnessed, the routines she observed, and the discomfort she endured as a child all point to a pattern of behavior that was troubling, deeply personal, and, in her words, disgusting. It was not simply a matter of royal protocol or eccentricity. It was a private truth that contrasts sharply with the public image the couple maintained for decades. And yet, despite the distance, despite the peculiarities, and despite the discomfort, there was resilience. The monarchy endured, the public remained largely unaware, and the family continued to navigate the complexities of private life under the relentless gaze of the world. Princess Anne's observations reveal not only the tension between public image and private reality, but also the extraordinary discipline, endurance, and quiet courage required to sustain a marriage and a monarchy over decades of scrutiny. So, as we explore this story, consider this. The perfect public image was a carefully constructed mask. Behind it was a household where silence reigned, habits diverged, and personal discomfort was hidden from view. Princess Anne's revelations pierced that mask, offering a glimpse into the private realities that shaped a family, influenced a monarchy, and challenged our assumptions about duty, intimacy, and what it really means to live a life in public service. "I saw things no one else did," Princess Anne once confided, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of decades spent observing the private world of her parents. For years, she remained the quiet observer, the middle child navigating the intersection of family life and royal duty. But now, for the first time, she is speaking openly, and her insights reveal a side of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth that the public has never known. From the earliest days of her childhood, Anne's perspective was shaped by proximity. As the daughter of the reigning monarch, she was uniquely positioned to witness the inner workings of the palace, the subtleties of her parents' interactions, and the habits of a father who, despite public appearances, maintained a private life that was often bewildering. Unlike the press or distant courtiers, Anne had a front-row seat, and what she observed was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Growing up in Windsor Castle and later at Balmoral and Sandringham, Anne experienced the strict rhythms of royal life. Early mornings, structured lessons, formal etiquette training, and an unyielding awareness that one's actions were never entirely private. Within this disciplined environment, the dynamics between her parents became clear. Elizabeth embodied composure, grace, and a quiet determination to maintain harmony. Philip, meanwhile, displayed behaviors that were often puzzling, occasionally irritating, and sometimes deeply personal, and recalls moments that, at the time, seemed ordinary, but in hindsight, were indicators of a larger pattern. For instance, the unusual routines surrounding bedtime were always present, though never openly discussed. While most children take their parents' habits for granted, Anne noticed a distinct separation between her mother and father. The rooms they occupied, the timing of their retirements, and the way Philip moved about the house suggested boundaries that were private, rigid, and purposeful. The most striking insight, according to Anne, was the contrast between public and private personas. Philip's charm, humor, and wit were on full display during official engagements. Yet in the privacy of their home, he exhibited routines that were peculiar, sometimes uncomfortable for those around him, and, in Anne's words, disgusting. She doesn't use that term lightly. It reflects the emotional impact of what she witnessed. It is one thing to tolerate eccentricities, but another to live with behaviors that challenge comfort and boundaries, even within one's own family. Princess Anne also observed how these private realities shaped family interactions. Siblings learned early on that certain topics were taboo, certain behaviors were not to be questioned, and certain spaces were off-limits. Yet, Anne's perceptive nature allowed her to notice subtle cues, a flinch at the wrong moment, a whispered comment by staff, or a glance between her parents that betrayed unspoken tension. These observations, accumulated over years, gave her a nuanced understanding of the complexity of her father's behavior and her mother's coping strategies. Staff members, too, contributed to Anne's perspective. Palace staff, while bound by discretion, often shared stories in hushed tones that revealed the private rhythms of the household, and recalls learning, sometimes by accident, about her father's habits that were never discussed at family meals or during public outings. These insights, combined with her own observations, painted a picture of a home where appearances were meticulously maintained, but private reality was far more complicated. Education and socialization within the palace also played a role in shaping Anne's perspective. From a young age, She was taught the importance of duty, decorum, and discretion. These lessons were essential for surviving in a family under constant scrutiny, yet they also heightened her awareness of contradiction. She learned to distinguish between what was performed for public consumption and what was real. And this distinction became critical in understanding her father's behavior, her mother's responses, and the household dynamics that would persist for decades. Anne's insider perspective also highlights the emotional resilience required to navigate such a household. Growing up, she had to reconcile the love and respect she felt for her father with the discomfort and confusion caused by his private habits. She had to admire her mother's composure while recognizing the sacrifices Elizabeth made to maintain peace and stability. This duality, and later explains, taught her about the complexities of human relationships, the weight of duty, and the courage required to speak truthfully about family, even when it might shock the world. It was not just observation that shaped Anne's insights, it was reflection. Over the years, as she matured and assumed more responsibility within the royal family, she came to understand the broader implications of what she had witnessed. The separation of her parents' private lives, the unusual routines, and the discomfort caused by Philip's habits were not merely family quirks. They were part of a pattern that defined the household's private reality. And as she prepared to speak publicly, and realized that her perspective could shed light on a story that had been obscured by decades of discretion, loyalty, and protocol, her voice now provides clarity where there was once speculation, where journalists had guessed and knows, where historians have theorized, she has observed. And her willingness to speak publicly about what she witnessed is both rare and courageous. It is one thing to analyze royal behavior from afar. It is another to reveal the private truths of one's own family, knowing that doing so could attract criticism, disbelief, or sensationalist scrutiny. Through her insider perspective, Princess Anne also highlights the broader tension between duty and intimacy. Elizabeth and Philip were bound by duty to their country, to the monarchy, and to public expectation. Yet personal intimacy, the kind that sustains a marriage, was complicated by habits, routines, and boundaries that were rigid and deeply private. Anne's account reveals the human cost of this tension, showing how even those at the pinnacle of society are subject to challenges, discomfort, and emotional strain in private life. And yet, despite all of this, there was a remarkable resilience within the family. Anne's reflections convey admiration for her mother's composure, empathy for her father's complexities, and a clear-eyed recognition of how family dynamics operate behind closed doors. Her perspective is not merely judgmental. It is insightful, nuanced, and deeply human. She understands that what she observed was part of a broader pattern of private behavior, shaped by personal preference, historical context, and the pressures of royal life. Finally, Anne's perspective underscores the importance of voice and truth. For decades, she remained silent, observing and reflecting. But as time passed, she recognized that her voice could illuminate what had been hidden. The separation of her parents' private lives, the habits she witnessed, and the discomfort endured within the household are now revealed not as gossip, but as testimony from someone uniquely positioned to understand the full picture. Her perspective bridges the gap between public myth and private reality, offering the world an unprecedented glimpse into the life of Britain's most famous royal couple. And as she begins to recount the details, one thing becomes clear. The story of Prince Philip and Queen Elizabeth is far more complex, far more human, and far more shocking than anyone ever imagined. What Anne observed and now shares sets the stage for revelations that will challenge assumptions, provoke emotion, and leave the world questioning everything it thought it knew about one of history's most iconic marriages. A marriage is often defined by its private moments, by the intimacy shared behind closed doors, and by the simple rituals that bind two people together. For most couples, sharing a bed is one of those rituals, a place for comfort, conversation, and closeness. But for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, that ordinary expectation was never part of their reality. The question that has puzzled royal watchers for decades is simple yet profound. Why did the Duke of Edinburgh never sleep in the same bed as the Queen? On the surface, explanations range from health considerations to personal preference, from royal protocol to simple routine. But Princess Anne's revelations suggest that the truth is far more unsettling than anyone could have imagined. According to her, this was not just a matter of habit or comfort. It was a reflection of her father's private behavior, habits that she describes as disgusting, and that even her mother had to silently endure. Imagine the royal bedrooms, the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, the historical weight of Windsor Castle, the cozy retreat of Sandringham. Each room meticulously furnished, with linens as precise and ceremonial as the monarchy itself. And yet, within these spaces, the separation of the queen and her husband was absolute. While courtiers and historians speculated, nobody truly understood the dynamic until Princess Anne stepped forward to reveal the details. As a child, Anne noticed the clear boundaries. While Elizabeth's bedroom was arranged for rest and comfort, Philip's personal space had its own peculiar setup. Staff observed that he would retire on his own schedule, sometimes in unusual attire or engaging in routines that would make anyone else pause in discomfort. The separation of their sleeping arrangements was not a temporary choice. It was an enduring pattern that persisted over decades, suggesting that Philip's behavior went beyond eccentricity into something more personal and private. For the Queen, the separation must have been an exercise in quiet endurance. Imagine lying in a room designed for rest, next to a partner whose habits are unpredictable, uncomfortable, or unspeakable. Elizabeth, bound by duty and an unwavering sense of decorum, chose discretion over confrontation. She maintained her composure, ensured the household ran smoothly, and continued to embody the grace the world expected of her. But for those who observed closely, like Princess Anne, the reality was clear. This was a marriage in which physical intimacy was defined by distance, and private boundaries were shaped by habits that challenged comfort and propriety. Staff testimony, combined with Anne's observations, paints a vivid picture of what life was like behind palace doors. The palace staff, bound by strict loyalty, often spoke in euphemisms or jokes about Philip's bedtime routines. They hinted at habits that, while tolerated, were far from typical. Anne recalls how even as a child, she sensed a tension, a quiet discomfort, and an awareness that what occurred in those bedrooms was not the kind of domestic normalcy the public assumed. Historical context adds another layer of complexity. Some might argue that separate beds were a tradition among certain royals, especially in the early to mid-20th century. Privacy, health, and ceremonial obligations were often cited as reasons for couples not sharing a bed. But in this case, Anne emphasizes that Philip's separation was not purely traditional, it was personal. The behaviors she witnessed went beyond protocol, hinting at preferences and habits that were unusual, challenging, and, in her candid assessment, disgusting. Consider the psychological impact on the children. For Anne, observing these private routines created a mix of confusion, curiosity, and eventually understanding. She noticed patterns in her father's behavior that contrasted sharply with the public image of devotion. She saw her mother navigate these situations with grace, rarely showing discomfort, yet always maintaining an awareness of propriety. These early lessons were formative, teaching Anne about the complexities of human behavior, the necessity of discretion, and the courage required to speak truthfully when one is finally ready. The bed itself became a symbol of the dichotomy between public appearance and private reality. While the world imagined closeness, comfort, and marital harmony, the reality was starkly different. The Queen's bedroom was her refuge, a space for rest and reflection. Philip's separate room, in contrast, contained routines and behaviors that challenged the household's equilibrium. Anne's recollections reveal a tension between intimacy and distance, illustrating that even in the most iconic marriages, private habits can create spaces of emotional and physical separation. Princess Anne also provides insight into the routines themselves. Philip's retirement was often scheduled independently of Elizabeth, sometimes accompanied by unusual personal habits. Staff would quietly adjust to his schedules, preparing rooms and linens in ways that ensured minimal disruption. The Queen, by contrast, maintained a predictable rhythm, balancing personal comfort with the needs of the household. For Anne, these patterns were not just peculiar. They were indicative of a deeper dynamic, a relationship in which personal comfort and behavior created enduring physical and emotional distance. Moreover, the separation of the bed was intertwined with secrecy. The palace is a world where appearances are carefully curated, and private truths are often hidden to protect reputation and tradition. Princess Anne's perspective emphasizes that this separation was never discussed publicly, and even within the family, it remained largely unspoken. It was a silent understanding, a boundary defined by personal habit rather than explicit communication. And yet, for those observing closely, the implications were unmistakable. Anne's account also challenges assumptions about intimacy in marriage. We often equate closeness with shared space, physical proximity, and visible affection. In this case, however, intimacy was redefined. Elizabeth and Philip maintained a public partnership characterized by duty, coordination, and mutual support. Privately, however, the rituals of closeness were constrained by Philip's habits, creating a marriage in which distance was as defining as any shared moment. For Anne, understanding this reality required careful observation, reflection, and eventually, the courage to speak about what she had witnessed. The story of the bed that was never shared is not simply about furniture or sleeping arrangements. It is about power, boundaries, and the delicate negotiation of comfort and propriety within one of the world's most scrutinized households. It is about how a daughter, observing the intricacies of her parents' private lives, comes to understand the interplay between public duty and personal preference. And it is about the courage required to break silence, to reveal truths that challenge assumptions, and to shine a light on a side of royal life that has long been hidden. As Princess Anne recounts these details, the picture that emerges is both fascinating and disturbing. The separation of the bed, once thought to be a minor curiosity, becomes a symbol of deeper truths: Philip's unusual private habits, Elizabeth's quiet endurance, and the complex dynamics that shaped a family and a monarchy. It is a revelation that forces viewers to reconsider everything they believed about the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. But what happened within those rooms, the private moments, the habits, and the behaviors that defined decades of Philip and Elizabeth's marriage, was far more shocking than the separation itself. What Princess Anne witnessed next would challenge even the most loyal observers of the royal family, revealing details so personal, so unsettling, that they had remained hidden for generations. Behind every iconic figure lies a side that the public rarely sees, a side shaped by personal quirks, private routines, and habits that often go unnoticed. For Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, this hidden dimension was as fascinating as it was disturbing. To the outside world, he was the charming, witty consort of Queen Elizabeth, known for his blunt humor, occasional irreverence, and steadfast support of the monarchy. But within the walls of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Sandringham, Princess Anne observed a very different side of her father, one that was private, peculiar, and, in her words, disgusting. From Anne's perspective, Philip's routines were more than eccentricities. They were a constant presence, shaping the household's rhythms and impacting the family in subtle but profound ways. Every evening, every private moment, seemed governed by rituals that only he fully understood, and that required everyone around him to adapt. The Queen, despite her calm exterior, accommodated these habits with quiet endurance, while the children and staff learned to navigate the idiosyncrasies without comment, and recalls, vividly, the strict routines her father maintained. It wasn't merely a matter of sleeping in a separate bed. It was the precise timing, the personal behaviors, and the rituals that created an environment uniquely Philip's. Staff would prepare his room according to his specifications, adjust schedules to match his preferences, and even subtly monitor interactions to ensure there were no surprises. For those growing up in the palace, these routines became a normal backdrop, but for Anne, growing up close enough to witness them, the strangeness was undeniable. Among the most unusual habits were those surrounding cleanliness, clothing, and personal preparation. Princess Anne describes Philip's routines as highly private and, at times, unsettling. He had specific ways of managing his personal space, strict preferences for attire and nighttime routines, and behaviors that were often conducted in isolation. While the Queen's bedroom was a place of rest and predictability, Philip's room was governed by rituals that sometimes bordered on the bizarre, and they were a constant reminder of the distance between the couple. It wasn't just about physical separation. It was about a private world that only Philip occupied, and observed that his habits often included meticulous attention to seemingly minor details, a level of control over his personal environment that was unusual even by royal standards. Staff learned to anticipate his preferences without question. Any deviation could result in tension or discomfort. And yet, while some might dismiss these behaviors as eccentric and recognized a pattern that went beyond quirks, habits that created emotional and physical boundaries within the household. One of the most striking aspects, according to Anne, was the effect these habits had on those closest to him. Elizabeth, ever composed, tolerated these routines without complaint. She maintained her grace, her schedule, and her focus on duty. The children, meanwhile, learned early to observe without interfering, to navigate the palace with sensitivity to Philip's preferences. For Anne, this early exposure to the private habits of her father shaped her understanding of human complexity, discretion, and the fine line between tolerance and discomfort. Staff anecdotes support Anne's observations. Those who worked closely with Philip often described him as demanding yet predictable, capable of sudden moods yet deeply rooted in his routines. While the public saw his charm, those inside the household witnessed behaviors that were more private and peculiar. Some staff members recalled moments that were awkward, even uncomfortable, particularly when Philip's personal habits intersected with family routines. These stories, long whispered and unrecorded, now gain clarity through Anne's testimony, painting a vivid picture of a man whose private world was as structured as it was unusual, and also highlights how these habits extended beyond mere logistics. They influenced family interactions, daily schedules, and even the emotional atmosphere of the household. Philip's routines dictated when he would appear, what he would tolerate, and how the Queen and children adjusted their lives around his preferences. While discipline and order are hallmarks of royal life, in this case, the habits were highly personalized, creating a household dynamic in which the private behaviors of one individual shaped the experience of everyone else. The contrast between Philip's private habits and his public persona is striking. To the world, he was the ever-present consort, attending events, supporting charities, and accompanying the Queen with steadfast composure. Behind closed doors, however, the picture was different. His routines, while not necessarily harmful, were deeply unusual. Princess Anne notes that some behaviors were uncomfortable to observe, even for adults, and that they contributed to a household environment where distance and private boundaries were carefully maintained. What made these habits particularly noteworthy was their consistency over time. They were not sporadic or occasional. They were enduring patterns that defined decades of family life. And observed them from childhood into adulthood, noting that the separation of the bed, the meticulous attention to personal routines, and the private behaviors all contributed to a household defined as much by routine as by affection. This long-term consistency suggests that these habits were an essential aspect of Philip's personality, shaping both his own life and the lives of those around him. And yet, there was resilience and adaptability. Elizabeth's composure, Anne's observations, and the staff's professionalism created a system in which Philip's habits could coexist with the demands of royal life. The family adjusted, accommodated, and navigated these routines without public scandal. But for Anne, witnessing these behaviors firsthand offered an unfiltered understanding of the complexities of marriage, intimacy, and familial responsibility. It was a perspective that few outsiders could ever grasp, and it is this perspective that makes her revelations so compelling. Anne's account also emphasizes that the private habits were not merely logistical or eccentric. They were personal, sometimes uncomfortable, and, in her own words, disgusting. While she does not dwell on sensationalism, the candidness of her description underscores the impact of these routines on those who lived with them daily. It is a rare glimpse into the challenges of living with a family member whose private world is so markedly distinct from public expectations. Perhaps most importantly, Anne's observations reveal the human side of both Philip and Elizabeth. These routines, while unusual, are part of a broader story about compromise, endurance, and the complexity of personal relationships. Elizabeth tolerated, adapted, and maintained composure. Philip maintained his private space, his routines, and his autonomy. And, observing all of this, learned not only about the eccentricities of her father, but also about the resilience required to maintain a family under scrutiny. Through this lens, the separation of the bed and the private habits of Prince Philip take on deeper meaning. They are not merely curiosities. They are reflections of personality, preference, and the complex negotiation of intimacy in one of the world's most high-profile marriages. Anne's insight turns what might have seemed trivial into a profound revelation about family, duty, and the hidden dimensions of human behavior. And yet, as remarkable as these insights are, they are just the beginning. It is said that silence can speak louder than words, and in the case of Queen Elizabeth, that adage could not be truer. For decades, she endured the peculiar, sometimes disturbing, private habits of Prince Philip with a composure that became legendary. To the public, she appeared serene, unflappable, and utterly devoted to duty. But behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Sandringham, the Queen's silence was not mere stoicism. It was a carefully measured response to the complexities of her marriage. Princess Anne, reflecting on her mother's behavior, describes it as nothing short of extraordinary. From a young age, Anne observed Elizabeth navigating moments that would challenge anyone's patience, dignity, and emotional strength. Philip's private routines, which included peculiar sleeping habits, unusual personal behaviors, and rigid rituals, could have created friction or discomfort. Yet Elizabeth responded with grace, discretion, and an unwavering commitment to maintaining harmony within the household. It is easy to assume that silence equals indifference, but it makes it clear that this was far from the case. Elizabeth's quiet demeanor masked a deep awareness of her husband's habits, a keen understanding of human behavior, and a strategic approach to preserving both personal dignity and family stability. She learned to adapt to Philip's eccentricities, tolerating behaviors that might have caused tension in any ordinary marriage, and transforming them into an accepted part of life behind palace walls. One striking aspect, according to Anne, was Elizabeth's capacity to compartmentalize. She could fulfill her public duties with poise, attend ceremonial events with unwavering composure, and manage the monarchy's affairs with diligence, all while silently navigating the private challenges of her marriage. This duality, Anne observed, required immense emotional intelligence. The Queen had to balance the expectations of the public, the responsibilities of the crown, and the personal realities of a husband whose habits were deeply private and often uncomfortable. The Queen's silence also extended to the children, and recalls that discussions about Philip's behaviors were rare, often avoided entirely. Children were taught discretion, respect, and the importance of maintaining appearances, yet they were also acutely aware of the unspoken tensions within the household. Elizabeth's approach was subtle but effective. She modeled resilience, set boundaries without confrontation, and maintained a private equilibrium that allowed the family to function. Staff members often marveled at Elizabeth's composure. They saw her navigate Philip's routines, accommodate his peculiar habits, and maintain the public image of a united couple without ever losing patience or propriety. And recounts instances where staff, aware of Philip's unusual behaviors, would quietly adjust plans to prevent disruption. Through it all, the Queen remained composed, ensuring that neither her family nor the public witnessed discomfort or tension. This silence, however, was not passive. According to Anne, it was a form of active management. Elizabeth understood the importance of discretion, the power of perception, and the necessity of maintaining stability in a household under constant scrutiny. Her silence was strategic. It was a tool that allowed her to preserve her dignity, protect her family, and navigate the complexities of life with a partner whose habits were deeply private. Yet, while Elizabeth's silence preserved order, it also created emotional distance, and observed that the Queen often carried the weight of discomfort privately, managing her own reactions without outward expression. This required a level of self-discipline and emotional resilience that few could comprehend. By not confronting or vocalizing her feelings, Elizabeth maintained harmony but also internalized the challenges of living with Philip's unusual routines. Anne's perspective offers insight into the subtle ways Elizabeth coped. She developed routines of her own, spaces of personal retreat, and moments of quiet reflection. These private strategies allowed her to navigate her marriage without public scandal while maintaining the equilibrium of the household. Elizabeth's approach demonstrates a remarkable ability to balance duty with personal endurance, public expectation with private reality, and loyalty with the need for personal boundaries. One of the most poignant observations Anne makes is about the Queen's empathy and understanding. Despite Philip's behaviors, Elizabeth never allowed resentment to dominate her responses. She maintained a focus on the broader picture: family stability, public duty, and the continuity of the monarchy. Her silence was not indifference, but a deliberate choice, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and the complexities of long-term partnership. The Queen's silence also had implications for her relationship with her children, and notes that the family learned early to respect boundaries, observe without comment, and navigate the household with awareness of the private dynamics at play. This upbringing, shaped by Elizabeth's example, instilled in the children lessons about discretion, resilience, and emotional intelligence, lessons that would stay with them into adulthood. Yet, even with this composure, Anne emphasizes that the private realities of the marriage were not without impact. The distance created by Philip's habits, the unusual routines, and the lack of shared intimacy influenced the family's emotional environment. Children were aware of the separation, of the private eccentricities, and of the careful negotiations that their mother undertook to maintain harmony. Elizabeth's silence was both protective and adaptive, but it could not erase the subtle tension created by a partner whose private behavior challenged norms and comfort. Staff anecdotes further illustrate the Queen's delicate management of the household. They recall moments when Elizabeth would calmly handle Philip's eccentricities, intervening only when necessary, and always maintaining decorum. The children, observing this balance, learned the value of patience, observation, and silent understanding, and reflects on how these experiences shaped her perspective on leadership, family, and the delicate balance between personal comfort and public duty. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Elizabeth's silence, and notes, is its longevity. Decades passed with Philip maintaining his private routines, and Elizabeth consistently responded with grace and composure. There were no public confrontations, no scandalous outbursts, and no visible signs of distress. The Queen's ability to endure, adapt, and preserve both family and public image over such an extended period is a testament to her strength, emotional intelligence, and unwavering commitment to duty, and also highlights the subtle moments of resilience and quiet assertion. While Elizabeth rarely vocalized discomfort, she established boundaries, created private spaces, and managed the household in ways that ensured stability. Her silence was not passive submission, it was strategic action, a careful negotiation that preserved dignity and balance in a household marked by unusual private behaviors. In reflecting on her mother's reactions, Anne offers a rare glimpse into the human side of monarchy. Elizabeth was not simply a figurehead or ceremonial icon. She was a woman navigating complex personal dynamics with discretion, intelligence, and emotional resilience. Her silence was a choice, a tool, and a strategy that allowed her to manage private challenges without compromising public duty. And yet, for Anne, observing this silence was both instructive and unsettling. She saw the tension between private endurance and public composure, the subtle negotiations required to maintain harmony, and the emotional complexity of living with a partner whose habits were deeply private. It was a lesson in resilience, discretion, and the power of silent management, one that would shape her own perspective on family, duty, and honesty. But as remarkable as Elizabeth's silence was, it could not hide everything. The habits, the routines, and the private behaviors that defined Philip's life behind closed doors were about to intersect with moments that would reveal more than even the Queen's discretion could contain. For decades, the world has been fascinated by the life of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, but few have had the vantage point that palace staff held. These were the people who moved quietly through the corridors of Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and Sandringham, witnessing the private routines of the royal family day in and day out. They were the silent observers, the keepers of secrets, and in many ways, the custodians of truth behind the public facade. And now, Princess Anne has revealed what they saw, and it is far more revealing than anyone ever imagined. From the moment they were hired, staff members learned that discretion was non-negotiable. Whispers of eccentric habits or unusual routines were shared only in hushed tones among colleagues, often with a mixture of nervous laughter and awe. They were told, implicitly and explicitly, that the public image of the monarchy must be preserved at all costs. Yet the staff were also human. They noticed patterns, oddities, and private behaviors that, over time, painted a very different picture of palace life than what the world saw in newspapers and official photographs, and recounts countless anecdotes from staff members that shed light on Prince Philip's private habits. Some of these stories were amusing, revealing the Duke's penchant for unexpected humor, mischievous antics, or impromptu instructions that left staff scrambling. Others, however, were unsettling, hinting at behaviors so peculiar, personal, and private that they challenged the normalcy of the household. Staff had to learn to anticipate his needs, adapt to his routines, and sometimes endure discomfort silently. One recurring theme was Philip's strict adherence to ritual. Whether it was the timing of meals, the arrangement of his personal quarters, or the order in which he conducted private tasks, Philip demanded precision. Staff quickly learned that deviation was not tolerated lightly. While Elizabeth's routines were predictable and harmonious, Philip's required constant attention and adjustment, and emphasizes that this created a household rhythm dominated by his private habits that shaped the day-to-day lives of everyone within the palace. The separation of bedrooms, for instance, was not merely a matter of personal preference. Staff noted that Philip's room was meticulously prepared for him according to his exact specifications, from the temperature of the room to the arrangement of furniture and linens. Any variation could cause discomfort or irritation. Meanwhile, the Queen's bedroom maintained a sense of calm order, reflecting her own predictable routines. These contrasting spaces symbolized the distance between husband and wife, a physical manifestation of the private habits that defined their marriage. Some staff shared stories that revealed the oddities in Philip's personal behaviors. For instance, he had peculiar approaches to personal attire and grooming, often requiring assistance or adherence to very specific preferences. While the public might see a perfectly dressed, confident Duke at official events, staff witnessed the private routines that made those appearances possible, routines that were sometimes difficult to watch or understand, and describes these behaviors as a key reason for the distance between the couple and why the Queen had to navigate her own private space with care. Staff also observed the subtle ways in which Elizabeth managed these situations. The Queen's composure was remarkable. She rarely intervened overtly, instead adjusting the household to accommodate Philip's preferences. From their perspective, it was a delicate balancing act, maintaining royal protocol, ensuring the household ran smoothly, and protecting the family's privacy. And notes that watching her mother navigate these challenges taught her early on about grace under pressure, quiet negotiation, and the emotional resilience required to manage complex relationships. There were, however, moments that went beyond routine and ritual. Staff occasionally noticed behaviors that seemed odd or even uncomfortable, hinting at personal habits that Philip preferred to keep private. These behaviors were rarely discussed openly. Staff were trained to observe and adapt, never question. Yet over time, these repeated patterns contributed to a deeper understanding. The Duke's private world was complex, sometimes unsettling, and often hidden from view, even to those closest to him. And recounts that staff members often bonded over their shared experiences, quietly sharing observations in ways that allowed them to navigate the household with minimal disruption. Some whispered about Philip's eccentricities. Others noted the meticulous preparation required to meet his demands. Collectively, these accounts reveal a household heavily influenced by the Duke's private habits, a household where personal routines shaped the lives of everyone who worked or lived there. The stories also illuminate the Queen's private endurance. Staff witnessed her navigating Philip's habits with patience and discretion, managing the household with remarkable composure, and maintaining the public image of marital harmony, and emphasizes that this was no small feat. Elizabeth's ability to silently endure and adapt created an environment in which both duty and personal comfort were carefully balanced. The staff's accounts reinforce this perspective, offering a rare glimpse into the intricate dynamics of the royal household. One particularly striking observation is the way staff noticed tension and anticipation around Philip's private routines. Even small deviations could cause ripple effects through the household. Staff had to learn to anticipate these routines without being asked, creating a system of silent coordination that ensured the Duke's habits were accommodated without disrupting the Queen or the family. For Anne, witnessing this level of coordination revealed the profound impact of Philip's private habits on daily life and on the family's emotional environment, and also highlights how staff perspective adds credibility to her revelations. While some may dismiss stories from family members as biased, the consistent accounts of long-serving staff members provide independent confirmation of the household's unique dynamics. Their observations support her description of Philip's routines, the separation of bedrooms, and the Queen's remarkable composure in managing her husband's private behaviors. Together, these perspectives create a fuller picture of a marriage defined by both public duty and private eccentricities. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of these staff accounts is the degree of loyalty and discretion they maintained. They were witness to behaviors and routines that, if revealed at the time, could have caused scandal or disrupted public perception of the monarchy. Their silence was a testament to the culture of the palace: loyalty, discretion, and service above personal judgment. Yet, through Anne's narrative, we finally gain access to these long-hidden truths, offering insights that have remained secret for decades. The collective perspective of the staff reveals a household shaped as much by private habits as by duty, tradition, or public expectation. Philip's routines dictated the pace of the day, influenced interactions, and created spaces of both tension and adaptation. Elizabeth's quiet management of these routines ensured continuity, stability, and grace. And, observing all of this, internalized lessons about discretion, resilience, and the complexities of human behavior that few outside the palace could ever understand. And yet, for all the preparation, adaptation, and quiet endurance, the reality of Philip's habits could not remain entirely hidden. Princess Anne would later reveal details so personal, so extraordinary, that even the staff, long accustomed to the Duke's private quirks, were left astonished. Childhood is a time of curiosity, innocence, and observation. For the children of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, this period was anything but ordinary. Growing up in palaces steeped in history, surrounded by staff and protocol, and constantly in the public eye, their childhood experiences were unique. But what they observed in the private spaces of the household left an indelible mark on their understanding of family, behavior, and human complexity. Princess Anne, the keenest observer among the siblings, often noticed things that went unseen by outsiders. From a young age, she was attuned to the subtle rhythms of the palace, the separation of bedrooms, the timing of her father's routines, and the unspoken signals her mother used to maintain composure. These were not merely curiosities, they were lessons in discretion, emotional intelligence, and resilience. And recalls moments as a child when she would witness her father moving through the corridors at odd hours, or engaging in routines that seemed peculiar for anyone outside the royal household. At the time, they were curious, sometimes amusing, and occasionally perplexing. But as she matured, and came to understand that these routines were part of a broader pattern, reflecting Philip's private habits and the structure of their marriage. The children, including Anne, learned early on that certain behaviors were not to be questioned. Staff were aware and adapted, the Queen remained composed. But the children, by virtue of proximity and keen observation, began to form impressions that went beyond what was spoken. They saw the difference between public and private life, and they understood that appearances could be deceiving. Anne's early impressions were marked by a combination of intrigue and discomfort. She noticed the strict separation of private spaces and the rituals her father maintained, from bedtime routines to personal habits. These observations were formative, shaping her understanding of boundaries, privacy, and the subtle ways in which personal behavior influences family life. She also observed the delicate balance her mother maintained, managing both Philip's habits and the household's equilibrium. The children's perspective offers a rare window into the emotional landscape of the royal family. They were not merely passive witnesses. They internalized the behaviors they observed, learning lessons about patience, discretion, and adaptability. And, in particular, reflected on how these early experiences influenced her own approach to relationships, leadership, and personal boundaries later in life. Staff corroborated Anne's observations, noting how the children would quietly adapt to the household's rhythms. They became attuned to Philip's unusual habits, learned to navigate the household without disrupting routine.